toutes les conférences n'ont pas la chance d'avoir ce qu'on appelle des vedettes américaines, et bien nous, on a la chance d'en avoir 3 des vedettes américaines. Please welcome Karen Sandler, John Sullivan, and Keith Bergelt. Can you please join me on the stage? Je bascule en anglais parce que c'est nos vedettes américaines, on les applaudit. Karen, welcome. Please have a seat. John, thank you very much. Please have a seat. Keith, thank you. You all have a microphone, so you don't have to fight to get to be able to, so people can hear you, everybody can hear you. And maybe we can start by an introduction. Maybe we can start with you, Karen. You're the woman in here. And can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Karen Sandler. I am the Executive Director of the Software Freedom Conservancy. Do you want?
Yes, maybe you can explain what you're doing in...
Sure. I became interested in free and open source software because we are all interested in free and open source software. But I'm particularly interested because I'm a cyborg. Really? I have a heart condition, which means I'm at a very high risk of suddenly dying. So I have a defibrillator that protects me, and I cannot see the source code that is in my own body. So it turned me from being someone who thought that open source was cool and useful into someone who started thinking about the societal aspects of software and understand that free and open source software is essential for us to have safe and ethical technology overall. The software in my body is a metaphor for all of the software that we rely on.
Great. Maybe you can start with John. John, can you introduce yourself? You're not a cyborg. How are you?
No, I'm not. My name's John Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director at the Free Software Foundation. I've actually worked at the FSF since 2003, so 13 and a half years now. I've been the Executive Director just for the last 5, and during that time we've seen the FSF grow. We're about 50% larger staff-wise than we were when I first started as Executive Director. We just had our 31st anniversary in October. So it's very interesting to me to think about the fact that a lot of people at conferences like this have never known a world without the FSF existing and without free software existing. And I think everybody at the organization takes that responsibility very seriously, and we work very hard on a daily basis to make sure that people hear about the values associated with free software and its importance for a fundamentally free and democratic society. And personally, I came to free software not from a technology side. My background is in creative writing and the humanities.
Oh, really? So we have a cyborg and a humanist.
Yeah. No programmers so far. I think we've both done a little.
We both have programming
backgrounds. But I think we're both coming to this from a standpoint of really seeing the importance of free software for people, whether they develop software or not. So it's not just about being able to modify code, but the culture that's created, the kind of software that's created in a culture where programmers can freely modify and share each other's code. Everybody benefits from that.
Okay, great. Keith, what about you?
Keith Bergelt, I'm the CEO of Open Invention Network, which is an 11-year-old entity that came into being, and it's appropriate that I go after John because I kind of view what OIN is a patent protection zone, a patent non-aggression community development activity, which is designed to create a culture. Much like Richard Stallman 31 years ago created a culture around how we utilize make the appropriate use of copyrights and look for attribution and not personal gain from our copyrights and encourage more utilization. Open Invention Network came into being to develop a code of conduct through its license that embraces the notion open and collaborative development of technology that supports a modality for developing new innovation in society where 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, but it equals 6 or 10 or 20 when we bring smart people around the problem that we're attempting to solve or address in code. And so OIN has quietly become the largest patent non-aggression community in the history of technology, designed to support patent non-aggression and freedom of action in open source.
Okay, so you heard right just before your intervention that Linux, open source is everywhere now, in routers and Internet of Things. Now we have open source software everywhere. We just mentioned before that there's a connection between open innovation and open source. That's what we're saying here in France. I want to have your perspective from the other side of the Atlantic. Maybe we can start with you, John. So we have, let me rephrase, we have Karen. Karen's our cyborg. Karen is, is managing open source projects, making them grow. And John, who is on FSF, so he's the humanist. And Keith, who's looking at the copyrights, how to protect intellectual property and things like that. And you help people fight, you're going to explain. So John, from your perspective, how do you see the links between the connection between open innovation and open source, innovation and open source?
So the Free Software Foundation, we are based in the United States, but we view our work as being worldwide. And I'm sorry for my French, but that's something we have. About half of our membership is actually outside of the United States. And the GNU project, which we support, and the GNU General Public License, which has been the basis for much of what we're talking about here today, are both international projects and have international applicability. But certainly my personal familiarity is more with the United States than what's going on in other places, but we do try to expand that vision globally. And I think when we're talking about innovation, an important thing to start with is what we mean by innovation. You know, innovation is progress, creativity towards some end. But when I think, especially in the business world, we talk about innovation, we often assume we're talking about things like new features, new capabilities of software. But in the free software world, when we're talking about innovation, you know, we say that free software achieves those things, new features, technologies, better than other models of development because programmers are able to build freely on everything that came before them, and they can borrow from each other and learn from each other and stand on each other's shoulders. And that certainly does, history proves, lead to technical innovation. But also, a lot of times in free software, we spend time going back and doing things that have already been done in the proprietary world. For example, we're still working on getting a best-in-class free software video peer-to-peer communication system working. And you could say that innovation's already happened because we have Skype, but that's proprietary software. And so in free software, when we talk about innovation, we also mean innovation in terms of values. You know, how can we get this technology without sacrificing user freedom? We can't deny that proprietary software companies also invent things sometimes, and they innovate. But that's not the kind of innovation that we want. We want innovation that is not only technically awesome, but also respects its users. And so when we're talking about getting businesses and communities together, I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. We need to be supporting those companies which are innovating in the right way, not just taking the free software model and using that to produce software which they'll then distribute as partly proprietary or all proprietary. So when we talk about innovation, let's remember the values that we're innovating toward, not just the technology.
And does everybody agree to what was being said, Karen?
I agree, but I wanted to add an example. So very recently I was pregnant, and being a cyborg and having a defibrillator, I was shocked twice during my pregnancy because my heart did something that normal pregnant women's heart do. Pregnant women's hearts beat a little bit faster sometimes. They palpitate a little bit, and I see some people nodding in the audience who either who have children probably, or doctors.
Or the cyborg also.
Or other cyborgs. So we should meet afterwards. But what I realized is that I just wasn't the target audience for my defibrillator. The number of women who had my heart condition, who were pregnant, who had my defibrillator, was relatively small compared to the set of people who were the ordinary recipients of a defibrillator. And so it was a very easy example of where a company's fabulous innovation that I was thrilled to take part of. I'm so grateful to have my defibrillator and not have to worry about suddenly dying. But at the same time, I was out of options. I couldn't, if I had all the money in the world, hire medical care to alter my defibrillator. And so there's this balance between the idea of being locked into a single vendor sounds very theoretical, but in actuality, it is very real. And further is something that businesses have to worry about as well, because at the end of the day, you might have needs that your vendors are not anticipating, and it's perfectly reasonable, because I assure you that my medical device company does not want pregnant women to be shocked. That is the last thing they want. But at the same time, it just simply wasn't a focus for the software. So we at Conservancy are focused on creating alternatives, just as John was saying, the GNU project is as well. Supporting our project. And our project, we are based in the United States, but at this point, I don't think that anyone can do it alone. So practically every free software project is global in scale. And so this is something that we do together.
Keith, you didn't hear you about this connection between open source and open innovation, especially when you're a specialist in patents and things like that, and protection from the people who are doing open source project. You're part of one of your mission is to protect them. What's your take on that idea that open source innovation triggers open source, or open source triggers innovation?
I think, John's concept, when John's talking about freedom, to me, a lot of what I think about every day is how do we create more freedom of action, freedom of choice? The choice that Karen's talking about to engage with a device, to be able to kind of enhance it and to be able to understand the fact that there's code in that device, and some of that code that comes from a proprietary place may not be as upgradable, as vital, as useful as code that we might be able to actually have through an upgrade process. And I think we look at all of the industries. It's when OIN started 11 years ago, essentially open source and Linux were largely tied to the enterprise. We've seen a migration to the Android, which is a Linux-based device, runs on a Linux kernel, is built on a Linux kernel. And now we see the auto sector moving in that direction with automotive-grade Linux, and Toyota becoming front and center to be able to drive that along with Daimler and another of other companies. They recognize that this notion of co-opetition is central to their future. It was a notion that was much talked about in the early 90s, the idea that we need to collaborate to compete more effectively. I think that notion is so well established within the fabric of collaborative invention. That's part and parcel of what free and open source software is about. The idea that people can come together, as John talked about, build on each other, stand on each other's shoulders, and create new novelty, create things that were otherwise not possible. So I think we developed pathways to innovation, what I called in my first comments a modality. That modality is what we're looking to guard and protect more than anything else. That what happens with that modality, how people interact, how people build on each other's ideas, is about kind of the natural organic development designed to solve bigger and more important problems.
Karen, you want to react to that?
I agree with Keith, but I think that in some ways, I think industry hasn't embraced the collaboration fully. So I think we can say that free and open source software is in everything, but if we're honest, we have less freedom than we ever did before, right? Everything is being wrapped in a proprietary layer. And I think that companies are keen on collaborating together and innovating, but only to a certain point. And I think that that has been to the detriment of collaboration. And I think that if industry embraced, for example, copyleft a little bit more strongly, and Conservancy has projects that are permissively licensed, and we have projects that are also copyleft licensed, so we have both. But I would say that I think that if industry embraced sharing a little bit more and a little bit more thoroughly up and down the stack, we would see an intense amount of new innovation that we haven't seen before. And I think we've been, unfortunately, somewhat limited as companies sort of try to carve out more of their special sauce when they don't necessarily need to forward their ultimate business model.
Maybe the question is, you will react, Keith. Maybe the question is, we usually intellectual property was invented to maybe to encourage innovation. And so, is it encouraging intellectual property? Is it encouraging or innovation, or is it hampering innovation, Keith?
I think where companies are coming from, we're doing pretty well, Karen. I admit that we could do better. But companies are coming from a world where it's a 1 or a 0, where you're either protected, and they have tens of thousands. Some of the companies that are active have 50 or 60,000 patents that are active in open source. And I think that's a great step forward. I do believe, as Karen's suggesting, that we could have more, and it's kind of John's idea about how we invent and how what kind of values we embody when we invent and collaborate together, so that we recognize that it's about the ultimate, solving the ultimate problems. It's not just about our own positioning, but the reality is that it's open and closed. That's the world that we live in now, where people are making decisions about where they invent, where they file patents, where they differentiate. And their differentiation is fortunately much higher in the stack than it was before, so that it's not creating subluxations or bottlenecks low in the stack where we are ultimately collaborating, be it on the kernel or on libraries, development of libraries, or the lower stack parts of middleware. So I think it's part of an evolution. And sometimes we get stuck and we're not as aggressive in collaborating in the way that we probably should. But I see tremendous improvement from where we came from when Richard first started talking about FOSS, 35 years ago.
John, you wanted to add something?
So I think a couple of points about making sure companies are moving in the right direction and continuing to make progress, certainly, because certainly, they made big leaps. All the usage of free software in modern products is something that wasn't happening previously. But I think copyleft is a really important thing that we need to keep stressing. When a company or anybody distributes free software under a permissive license, that's still free software as long as they're supplying the source code that goes with it. But it's a kind of free software that can sort of be taken out of the commons. It doesn't have to stay free in the future. What was already released will still be available for people to build on. But for example, Android, Google in the past did decide for a while not to release the source code for a current version of Android. And it wasn't released for several months. And that can happen when the software is not copylefted. If we're going to truly have innovation based on a free software model, it needs to come from an expanding pool of software that anybody can build on. And permissively licensed software contributes to that, but in a kind of a weaker way, a less permanent way. It's still something that we encourage companies to do, but we really hope that everyone who starts with that will take the next step and more fully join the movement and the effort. And at the FSF, we really want to recognize companies that do keep values of user freedom at the top of their priority list. We have a certification program called Respects Your Freedom, fsf.org/RYF, and that's one way that we try to help companies kind of compete, differentiate themselves based on their positive treatment of users. They release all their source code for the devices that they sell. They don't distribute any proprietary software with it, no proprietary requirements going along with those products. We've certified about 19 products so far from companies in the UK, Romania, and the US, and have a lot more to come. And I think as a community and on the nonprofit side, that's one thing we can do to help companies see the benefits of fully participating in free software collaboration rather than just doing kind of dabbling in it or doing partly free and partly non-free still.
Karen, you wanted to add something? Because also I like to add something. Does Wall Street value open source? I know Wall Street value patents, but the problem when you have Wall Street valuing the patents, how can you also do the open source thing? Maybe you're going to add something, Karen?
On the previous point, I just wanted to add that at Conservancy, one of the programs we host is that for Linux kernel developers and some other projects like Debian, we host a GPL compliance project where we help developers enforce their license to make sure that companies are following it. And so there are two sides to that. One is that we see really cool stuff, right? When people give us reports that a company is not in compliance, it's usually because the person who's sending the report is trying to do something awesome with the product, trying to hack something cool together, whether it's a baby monitor or a car or something in their life, and they can't do it even though the license encouraged them to do it, which is unfortunate for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that when consumers are allowed to do such things, it brings a whole new life to the products that are already there, brings improvements back to those products, but also brings uses that the manufacturer may not have even considered. So that's really exciting stuff. And on the flip side, we understand that companies might be a little bit reticent if they're worried that someone's going to hold their feet to the fire about the licenses. And so we, along with the FSF, published principles of GPL enforcement, so basically assuring that lawsuits are a last resort and to take litigation risk out of the room so that we can help companies understand how to learn about compliance and how to learn about copyleft in a safer way. So there are sort of those two aspects of it. And then you asked another question. And
I was asking that Wall Street values patent and is not valuing open source. So that might be a problem sometimes.
Yes, and Kate, do you want to?
It values open source, I think, and you look at a company like Red Hat, which is one of the only true pure plays.
Yeah.
That's a pure open source company. It trades very high volumes on a daily basis. It's had, I think, 56.
But isn't that the exception that confirms the rule?
No, well, it's just that there aren't many pure play public companies, but
but most of them disappear.
I think some of them came out early, and the market probably wasn't ready for them. But I think that's a good point. 15 years ago, there were a bunch of companies that came out, or a handful that came out. But I think there are a variety of companies like Docker, for example. Yeah. Docker has a very high valuation. I think Docker's
unicorn. It's a unicorn.
Yeah, Docker's probably one of the most significant innovations in the last few years, it's spawned other kind of iterations with Kubernetes and the whole notion of storage in the cloud and containers. I think is something that has been captured the imagination of Wall Street.
Bitcoin also, maybe.
Yeah, I mean blockchain technology. I think Bitcoin's probably not the way we should have led with, but blockchain and what the Hyperledger project and other projects that are focusing on that technology, I think it's going to transform transactions, microtransactions at banks. It'll change contract law to some degree because of the ledgering process that's involved. And so I think these are all areas that are ripe for more public offerings and for more acquisitions. So there's been a significant number of acquisitions where real value has been paid for open source centric companies without patents.
I'm coming back to it, Karen. I just wanted to ask, this session is very interactive. I'm receiving many questions already, but keep on sending questions to our host, and they will answer them. Karen?
Wall Street is looking at all of this very, very closely, and they are looking at ways to become contributors and to become more involved with free and open source software generally. For example, Conservancy runs an internship program called Outreachy, which globally is for women to have internships in free and open source software. Within the US, we've expanded to people of color as well. For example, Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs have both sponsored that program. So they're looking for real ways to give back, understanding that they rely on this software and couldn't undertake their business in the way they do today without it.
John, what's for you the biggest challenge facing free open source software?
Well, I think we have a lot of challenges, but I think one of them ties directly into this point, which is if we want the investors and if we want the market to value free software and free software companies more, then we need to work on the demand side too and enable consumers, general public, to care about whether something that they buy is free software, has free software or not. Right now, that's not happening. It's really challenging to figure out if a particular product comes with all free software or has a mix of proprietary and free software. And right now, the general public understanding of this is based on mostly large corporate marketing budgets from Google, with the Android side being perceived, rightly so, as the more freedom-friendly option in the mobile space, and Apple, on the other side, being rightly perceived as the most restrictive. But the truth in both cases is a lot more complicated than that. The iPhone does use some free software underneath Android. Every Android device that's sold in retail stores comes with proprietary software on it. So I think a major challenge we have as we want companies who are doing free software to be valued accordingly, and as a social justice movement, we want everybody to have their freedom enabled by technology instead of to be controlled by technology. To both of those ends have an overlapping solution, which is we have to inform people and raise awareness about what free software is, and then once people understand, we have to give them a mechanism by which they can act on that. And we really don't have that right now. And our certification program, our label is one aspect. Some of the things that I saw last night at the award ceremony were along these lines too, of recognizing people who are taking steps, administrations, companies that are doing great things, and we need a lot more of that, because our big challenge is to have the entire world care about free software, whether they write software or not. And that's, if we want the free software movement to be a global movement for everybody, we have to do a much better job at communicating with everybody.
Maybe a question for all of you. What's your opinion on France, on France, and how do you see Europe on those issues and open source innovation? Maybe someone wanted to start? Keith?
I think the French government has made efforts in a variety of ways through academics, supporting academia, supporting research. The Software Heritage Program that Roberta will talk about later today is, I think, an interesting step forward to give kind of a national identity around kind of creating a normative version of basically an aggregation of code so that everybody understands the code that's out there, since it's dispersed right now in a variety of environments. I think there are, what's happening in Sophia Antipolis, there's software development, there's some, Amadeus is a very interesting software company, comes out of the proprietary world, which is using an increasing amount of open source software now, which is basically runs 60% of all searches for airlines and hotels in Europe. So I think there are examples where the SNCF and other, the railway systems are more part of a global, a regional pan-European program now designed to incorporate more open source into the rail systems, to be able to manage them more efficiently, to be able to upgrade them and make the rail systems more safe across government or across national boundaries. I think these are all examples of steps that we see that are happening across Europe and in France in particular, designed to kind of create an identity and to be able to move forward. I talk to companies in Germany and they say, well, if SAP is going to do something, then we'd be interested in, like OIN, for example, and having a relationship. And SAP is one of our participants in our community, but SAP comes to the proprietary world and is really learning and transitioning. And that's what we see in Europe, is companies, whether it's Bosch or whether it's Siemens or Alcatel, they're all transitioning to open source platforms. And they're doing so because there's an inevitability about collaborative development that you can't avoid. Very few companies can survive in the future unless they participate with others in this notion of collaborative development and innovation.
There was a question before for you, Keith, and what companies that are not joined OIN, and that you want them to join to come to you?
Well, we'd like all of the auto companies here in France
give us some names. We want some names.
We'd like Alcatel to join, and Intel, and Siemens, and
any French company?
And Bosch, sure. The Alcatel, and we'd love the SNCF, and we'd love all the French banks to become participants, because to the banking community, to John's point, Karen's point, to the banking community, open source is becoming increasingly relevant, because they're changing the way that they clear, the way that they provision services, the way they manage services for their clients, and the way customers actually interact with the bank is largely going to be enabled by open source.
Maybe Karen, your insight on Europe, France, and innovation open source?
I would say that a disproportionately high percentage of the key contributors to Conservancy's projects, and Conservancy has 40 projects, Git, Samba Wine, Inkscape, QEMU, Boost. We've got tons and tons of projects, and I would say a very disproportionate number of contributors, of the core contributors, are from France. I think that France has had a tradition of understanding the ideals behind free and open source software, and especially coming out of academia, have really embraced it and become such a global influence. And so I've been extremely impressed with both the contributions that we've received and also the local organization here in France. I've been very impressed with April and the French organizations. I think that this is leading to a massive global impact in the long run.
John?
Yeah, I'm very jealous of what happens here in France, and we see a similarly high level of contributors to the GNU project based in France. It's one of the reasons we're always working at getting our materials translated into as many languages as possible, but our monthly newsletter we do in Spanish and French for that reason. So I think one international thing that we're focused on lately is trade agreements, stopping agreements like the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but there will be others in the future which are trying to export the United States, bad laws from the United States, our overzealous copyright system, our patent system which allows wrongly software to be patented, our rules about DRM, digital restrictions management, we don't want to see those laws exported anywhere else around the world. So I hope that everyone in their respective countries will help work against the spread of those agreements when they include provisions like that.
Thank you very much, Karen, Sandler, John, Sullivan, and Keith Bergelt. You're from OIN, FSF, and what's the name of the software? Thank you very much. We can, on peut les applaudir. Thank you for your insight.